You're listening to... Whoa! Potluck.
Hey, Sharon.
Hey, Raman.
How are folks still racist?
I know, right? We're like 2 decades into the 21st century.
Yeah, and second question, where's my jetpack?
Well, I can't help you there, but have I got a podcast for you. Modern Minorities is a show where each week my longtime pal Raman and I uncover common and uncommon truths that we all need to hear for our majority brains and ears.
Yeah, Sharon and I have spoken to doctors, lawyers, directors, climate activists, angry Asians, athletes, chefs, writers.
Folks who are Black, brown, gay, straight, and everything in between.
Past guests have included comedian Margaret Cho, Southern Poverty Law Center journalist Geraldine Mariba, comics creator Jean Lun Yang, and many, many more.
We've even talked about Ramadan, Black History Month, Kamala Khan, and Robin being queer.
It's like we're trying to solve racism with the podcast.
Challenge accepted.
So check out Modern Minorities at modmypod.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.
Remember, we're all modern minorities, but we're no one's model minority.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to a bonus episode of the Asians in Hockey podcast. Today's episode is entirely comprised of a conversation I had with Dr. Courtney Szto, Associate Professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. The bulk of our conversation centered on her book, Changing on the Fly, Hockey Through the Voices of South Asian Canadians. I had originally planned on releasing this conversation in the final episode of the season, but a couple of things changed my mind. First, the conversation is so rich in information and perspective that I didn't want to try cramming it into an episode with other material. And second, Courtney will be speaking at the Hockey Conference, which, at the time I'm recording this, is taking place next week, June 17th through 19th in Winnipeg, Manitoba. She and our contributing producer, Chad Soon, will both be presenting at the conference. So, if you're interested in attending, you can register online at thehockeyconference2025.ca. I'll include a link in today's show notes. Okay, now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Courtney Szto. Our guest today is Dr. Courtney Szto, Associate Professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. She is the author of Changing on the Fly, Hockey Through the Voices of South Asian Canadians, and managing editor of Hockey in Society. She is happiest on the right wing, but if we need a left winger or a center, you're totally fine with that as well, right?
Yeah, I'll play anywhere pretty much. Sometimes goalie if I really need to.
Nice. Which is funny because in your book, you do mention that as a child, you had the dream of playing goalie in the NHL one day.
Yeah.
I actually would put you on the right wing on my team because I'm a left winger and I've got a couple friends who are on defense. So if you were on my team, you'd be on the right wing.
Perfect. I love being on the off wing. Cool.
So let's go ahead and dive into your book. Actually, this is why I wanted to talk to you. It's a phenomenal book. It's called, like I mentioned in the intro, it's called Changing on the Fly: Hockey Through the Voices of South Asian Canadians. What was fascinating to me is that you chose to research South Asian Canadians and their relationship to the game of hockey. But you're of East Asian descent. Mm-hmm. How does your identity, how did that shape your relationship or interaction with the participants and the project in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a reflective process when you try to engage with a community that is not yours, and even when you work with people who are your own community, there's different kind of considerations. But I grew up in North Delta in Vancouver, which at the time is, the diversity with South Asian and white folks. I could count the number of East Asian kids in my grade school on like one hand, basically. So I always kind of felt like the South Asian community was the community that I grew up in. So when the opportunity for this research project came around, I felt like, yeah, it's like, I know enough. I know enough people. I know the spaces that folks have to move in. I understand the racial politics in a lot of ways. I certainly learned a lot more from this project, but I had a good sense of the landscape. And so it was my experience kind of working at Sport Check in Surrey, working with a lot of South Asian customers coming in to buy hockey equipment, So I could see that there was definitely a desire to participate in the game. And at the time, I was doing my undergraduate degree in human kinetics at the University of British Columbia. Okay. And, I'm learning about sport management and these things. And we talk about kind of barriers to sport in very simplified ways. Like, if people don't understand the language and they can't play, if they don't have enough money and those things. But there was one young boy who came in with his mother one day, and he wore a patka, which is a small turban on his head. And at no point did money seem an issue for this family. They're just like, suit the kid up. And so I'm like, great. These are the customers that you love as a commission salesperson. And so I'm fitting him in gear, and he's just super excited to play hockey. And we get to the helmet. And I asked the mother if, he can take his patka down so that we can fit him with a helmet. She's like, not really. I was like, what if he can do it just when he plays hockey? And she's like, no. And it wasn't like an aggressive no or anything. She was just like, no, this is him. And so we couldn't find a helmet that really fit safely. And then they had a brief conversation in Punjabi. They left all the gear behind and they left the store. And it was one of those experiences that, like 10 years later, when I'm thinking about a doctoral project and I see hockey is for everyone kind of smeared across the NHL pages, like, is it for everyone? It was just one of those random examples that just kind of stuck with me for some reason. So that experience kind of led to the project, and through the project, I end up finding out that there are many Sikh children who play hockey without any issue, headgear not being a problem. But there are much other larger barriers that come into play once they are in the game. So yeah, that was definitely an interesting journey and a unique entry point for me to come to this research project.
Yeah. You had mentioned the phrase "hockey is for everyone," and I do find that pretty fascinating because you offer a bit of a pointed critique of that phrase, and that for anybody who's listening who's unfamiliar, for a number of years the NHL had this sort of campaign, I suppose, where the tagline was "Hockey is for everyone," and it was kind of this call for inclusivity. But I found what was interesting about your work overall, and even some of the landscape that I see as I sort of, navigate through the hockey world and have conversations with people, it does seem like all of that evidence suggests otherwise, that hockey might not be for everyone. Could you talk a little bit about that contradiction, perhaps, maybe the gap between the branding and the reality, specifically in Canadian society, because that's where you're located?
Yeah, I mean, I think the NHL could actually fix the problem with the addition of one word and just saying hockey should be for everyone. Let's treat this as an aspirational tagline as opposed to a factual one. Which is how they open the door to so much criticism all the time, because they say hockey is for everyone, and then time after time after time every season, there are many examples of hockey not being for everyone. So I think what's interesting about the Hockey is for Everyone campaign is that it started in 2011 as a racial diversity campaign. And now you know of it as like the everybody campaign. So it includes Pride, it includes Indigenous Heritage Month, it includes whatever kind of cause-related marketing the NHL might want to include in there. So then the racial diversity and racism of the game kind of gets diluted because now we're focusing on so many different issues. And in some ways it's good, and in some ways it's extremely problematic, because then it just becomes another check mark on the list of things that the NHL has to kind of encounter. So yeah, it's I'm sure it started with the good intentions. But I can't say that there's a whole lot that has changed. I mean, there's certainly been, some like the player inclusion committees and things like that have started post George Floyd. But the conversation in 2020 was, is this a reckoning for hockey and really every sport? And my answer at the time was always like, we'll have to tell. And I think, 5 years out, we can say it was not a reckoning. The needle moved a little bit. We had some conversations, language changed a little bit. But on the whole, I would say that we are in the same place, if not in some ways worse off than we were in 2020, especially politically speaking, right? It's a more dangerous space to be in sometimes.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I do think, perhaps that part of the reason for that was the influence of the larger political landscape on hockey. I mean, we look at, I often hear the critique of, and have participated in the critique of rainbow capitalism. And we see the complete shift in participation in Pride Month from major corporations. So I wonder if, as more conservative ideologies become normative yet again, is that now influencing what major companies and corporations and leagues like the NHL are doing. So something that I found particularly fascinating, both through reading your book and in conversations with my wife, who is Canadian, is this sort of critique of Canadian society and the mythology of Canadian society as being sort of this diverse landscape. I know Canadians like to refer to themselves as a mosaic, especially in contrast to the American self-image of a melting pot. But your work critiques that idea, using hockey as kind of the vehicle or basis for both the mythology and as a way to analyze and critique this mythology. Perhaps elaborating a little bit on that, but also could you maybe talk a little bit about how this belief of Canada and the connection of hockey to this Canadian ideology might exclude racialized Canadians, even those of us who, well, I say us, sorry, I'm not Canadian, but even those who play and are a part of and love the sport of hockey?
Yeah, I mean, Canadians kind of hang their hat, nationally speaking, on two pillars, one being that hockey is our game, and the second is that we're multicultural. And they're not untrue in some respects, but that's kind of the danger of mythology, is that they're partial truths, right? Mm-hmm. So, yes, hockey has a long history in Canada, and multiculturalism is a fact in some ways, right? Like, we are a diverse nation, but we use multiculturalism and diversity often as an alibi to say that we do not have a history of racism, or any racism is in the past and therefore it's not an issue today. And when you put these two together, they really start unraveling some threads, and the tapestry of kind of Canadian nationalism can fall apart very quickly. And that's very disturbing for a lot of people, because it's the good ideals that we think about ourselves, right? They're the stories that we tell about ourselves. And if those stories aren't true, then who are we as a nation, and what are we really about? And so those are some difficult questions to grapple with, especially in things that are supposed to make people kind of happy, like an escape like hockey. But yeah, the history of hockey comes from Indigenous origins, from Black Canadians, but really like those who escaped enslavement from the United States. So it's also equally American in some respects. And that is also something I think it was very hard for us to wrap our head around. And so there were, different groups contributing to the creation of modern day hockey as we know it. But we used it as a way to reify this idea of the Great White North and white settlement conquering nature. And so there's a lot of that kind of ideology of, the strong white Northern European really taking over a particular kind of landscape and controlling it and mastering it. And hockey is the sport articulation of that colonialism, essentially. And that folks who are racialized, generally from the global south, don't fit into this northern whiteness, both in a wintry kind of perspective, but also in skin color, right? So it's a myth that I believed. I grew up thinking that hockey was a white person's game, and I didn't really question it. And I didn't even question it even starting writing my thesis. And it was my supervisor who read my introduction, and he turned it back to me. He was like, go read more, basically. And that's when I started learning about the history of Indigenous hockey stick makers in the Mi'kmaq area of Nova Scotia today, and the Colored Hockey League, So these were things that, even though I had watched Hockey Night in Canada all my life, those weren't things that came up on Sports Desk and, those stories. So there has been a lot of work to erase those contributions and to tell a particular narrative that reproduces whiteness as normative in hockey, so that even we who love the game, grew up around the game, also will believe that we are other in that space in some ways, right? And that's kind of the work of racism, is to make you believe the things that aren't quite true. They don't feel true, but you start to kind of second guess yourself and your experiences.
Yeah. And I think that's also kind of borne out in some of the anecdotes that you share in your book. And I want to land on one in particular that's sort of a personal story that you shared of your own experience. And you described this moment where there was a man that was questioning your presence at a hockey event, despite I guess you were wearing some NHL fan gear, and of course your accent is pretty standard Canadian. So what did that interaction kind of bring up for you? What does that reveal about how hockey, perhaps? This word might be a bit strong, but I'll use it anyway, polices who belongs in the game?
Yeah, I think as a scholar and a researcher in the area, they are humorous interactions for me at this point, but I can definitely see how problematic they are when it's always just kind of like a nothing interaction, and yet they're microaggressions essentially, right? Death by 1,000 cuts to say, you're not quite supposed to be here, or like you're always a surprise when you are here. So this man that you're referring to, he was sitting next to me at I believe it was a Vancouver Giants game, and when I told him that I had played in that rink, he just kind of looks at me for a long second, and then he's like, "Oh right, China has a hockey team now." And like at no point did I tell him I was Chinese. I'm not from China. And so I was like, okay, so this is the shallow well that you're kind of pulling from, is that to picture me as a Chinese woman playing on that ice, he has to then make some other connection to a far off land and far off people that is not me and is also not him. Because it just doesn't make sense in his imagination, right? And this happened recently to me. I went to take my skates to get sharpened in Ottawa, where I've moved recently, so I need to find a skate shop, and that's always like a difficult experience to find the right people. And I walk into this place, and they kind of ask. There was an assumption that the skates weren't mine. But they weren't asking, like whose skates are they? Because I said I want a 9/16, and they're like, why? And I was like, confused because I was like, that's how I get them sharpened. And then the staff person was like, well, what position do they play? And I was like, well, these are my skates. And she was like, oh, so that's just how you like them sharpened. I was like, well, yeah. So it's just little interactions like that are constantly just so annoying. And they just serve to remind you as to like, okay, we still have a long way to go. We've made a lot of progress. But for the average person who doesn't think about this on a daily basis, and maybe their friend circle is not as diverse as it should be in 2025, we are still unusual in the space of hockey.
I want to go back to something you had mentioned previously about the history of hockey not being necessarily inherently a white sport, or hockey itself not inherently being a white sport, as a result of going through your research and finding out the stories of the game in indigenous roots, and of course the Colored Hockey League. So I really like your argument that efforts to, quote unquote, diversify the sport kind of miss the point that this history exists. What is it? Do you have ideas? I guess, for the next few minutes, we can talk about maybe dream a little bit or come up with some thoughts or ideas about how do we perhaps reach that goal of diversifying the game, quote unquote, through reclamation of those erased histories, those contributions from racialized communities?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a key part of anti-racism work is to make sure that we tell accurate histories and comprehensive histories, because then people, especially kids growing up, you don't think that you don't belong in those spaces, right? There is something to kind of anchor you and your sense of belonging, and it makes it a little bit harder for you to kind of walk away from those spaces when barriers do appear, right? Not impossible by any means, but it gives you you're not so alone in that fight, So I think when we tell forgotten or intentionally dismissed narratives through the media, through advertising, through just various forms of representation, that's an important privilege that white folks have had in the game of hockey, right? Like they know who their hockey heroes are. Most racialized people can't necessarily say that, or they've got like one or two to kind of hang their hat on. It's a very short roster, so to say. And so that can start to change the landscape a little bit. It's not going to do everything, but it is going to change representation and kind of how privilege is shared in that space. So I think that is some of the work that we do, is unearthing those histories, amplifying those histories, and making sure that people are educated, about the history of the sport that they are competing in. And I think that that's part of what our physical education should be, is not just the actual physical part, but like what are the histories of these activities and why are they the way that they are in these days. So yeah, I think that there is definitely a desire from certain athletes who are trying to kind of educate themselves to then pass it on to the kids that they coach, which I love. Brianne Jenner, she has tried to kind of work with some of the kids that she coaches, teaching them about the Colored Hockey League in kind of like a hockey IQ session. So usually you would use it for hockey strategy and things like that. But I love that she has interpreted that in multiple ways to be like, okay, sometimes we're going to talk about like the actual history of the game. If you want to play this game and say that you actually know it from top to bottom, then let's learn about it properly.
Yeah, that's really encouraging. And I think opportunities for education exist all over the place. You also mentioned institutions like the Hockey Hall of Fame, which and halls of fame kind of in general, which present a bit of an obstacle due to their privatized nature. But do you think there is a way to either encourage some of those organizations and institutions to work in this direction, or maybe partner with them, or do you see any possibility for the institutions to move the needle for us, or is it one of those things where, hey, maybe we need to develop or really build into our grassroots efforts in this area?
It would be nice if the institutions kind of leaned into those opportunities more, both financially and like with all the resources that they have. But realistically, I think it's always kind of like the grassroots, or if we think of like player labor, that drags institutions into more progressive spaces that they wouldn't necessarily want to be in. And I think the WNBA is a great example of that, in that their players are far more progressive than the league. We look at the league as like kind of a whole, and that, yes, they're the most progressive kind of professional sports league that we have in North America at this time. But it's because it's led by 80% Black women who have a very different idea of what equity and justice looks like, and that they have very concrete ways of getting from point A to point B. And they drag the league along with them kind of reluctantly. We don't have that in elite level hockey, right? We don't have players who truly understand what struggle is. And I don't want to dismiss like class struggle, because it's definitely part of the conversation, but to really understand what not being seen as a human being means, and to then, as a collective, to have enough kind of enough people to push some sort of agenda. We don't have that in hockey, and I think that that's kind of the problem. So no, I don't think that the Hockey Hall of Fame necessarily is like going to be the person or the institution that suddenly is like, oh, we need to change the way we view hockey history, but also kind of the standard of greatness. I think those need to kind of take place outside the institution, and like those kinds of things might force them to shift a little bit. But as we've seen, there's nothing that can really shame the hockey industry or community. Yeah. And that's really, really problematic. And I think that that's why this sport in particular is behind other men's professional sports, right? Like, we still don't have an out LGBTQ player in the league. That says a lot.
Oh, absolutely. Do you think that the growth of the PWHL might have an impact? Do you see any possibility for the PWHL to influence the NHL in some of these ways? And I say this fully recognizing that the PWHL also feels a little bit like a step back in some regards. I was a big NWHL/PHF fan for a number of years, and I did find that while that league did have quite a few missteps, it did kind of lean into sort of a progressive mindset, more so than I saw a lot of other leagues, the direction more so than I saw other leagues heading in. But now with the PWHL and the higher profile that LGBTQ players have in that league, do you think there's a possibility for some interplay there or some influence?
Maybe a little bit. I'm not necessarily hopeful in that respect that the NHL is going to look to the PWHL and be like, wow, look at what they're doing. We should be doing some of those things. But I know that I think this is also the problem of when you get really professional, quote unquote, but in the sense of like standardization of like the size and scope and the money that you're bringing in. It's easier when you are a kind of smaller grassroots organization to like operationalize those values. Once you become more corporatized, those things become more difficult and more bureaucratic in some ways. And And I know that they have really good people in places that have good intentions. So I hope that in the next few years, when things kind of are more settled, some of those values will shine to the surface in more concrete ways. But yeah, I think this is kind of like women's hockey trying to figure out what the future looks like with a lot of money to play with, which is like never been and something that they've had that kind of luxury. And then your values really get tested. You know, it's nice to have values when you don't have money. It's easy to do that. But when people start paying you and pulling sponsorships and saying, this is what we want and this is how we want it, I think that's when push comes to shove, and we'll see.
Yeah, true. You were alluding earlier to the fact that the burden of essentially, you know, anti-racist work, particularly in hockey, it falls on the shoulders of the racialized players, scholars like yourself, racialized fans. What might it look like for white participants to share in that labor in a meaningful way? Do you have suggestions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's a question that a lot of people have because they want to see something different, but they can never quite figure out what is the opportunity that they're supposed to speak up. When are they supposed to sit down? One, I think, is that you defend your players and families against racism with great vigor, you know, not being afraid to call out racism when you see it. And I think part of that problem is that people don't necessarily know when they see racism and, you know, how to draw that strict line. And I think racialized players have that problem too, in that we kind of give a lot of people the benefit of the doubt, and racism then becomes a narrower and narrower definition when it's really actually not that narrow. There's a lot of things that fall under that umbrella. So part of that is people understanding and self-educating as to what really counts as racism. So when they hear these comments in the stands, things like that, they can step up and be like, that's not acceptable in this space. Anything that people can do to make racist behaviors uncomfortable in the hockey space is the work that we're trying to do, right? Unfortunately, politically, it's become very okay to say certain things and wear certain things in spaces that make people uncomfortable. That's the work that we have to flip. And the right is very good at that, of like kind of making everybody else take up less space. We need to do that. And I think the trouble with hockey is that, and I've argued this before, is that it's too inclusive, right? So it hangs its hat on this idea of hockey is for everyone. Everyone means that neo-Nazis can fly their flags next to your pride flag.
Got it.
That's not okay, right? That you can say, okay, MAGA hats can be next to the Black Girl Hockey Club hats, right? Like this doesn't work. Inclusion needs to be inherently exclusive. And folks have a hard time saying you can't be here because we've been taught growing up, these kind of middle generations have been taught, no, everybody is supposed to have a space here. Ideally, yes. But if you're going to oppress the rights of other people and make it unsafe for them to be in that space, we have to then draw the line. So hockey hasn't quite figured out where that line is, because the NHL in particular, and if everybody else kind of follows suit, the NHL wants its conservative fan base as much as it wants a progressive fan base. Anybody who's going to buy NHL merch, they'll sell you whatever they have. And so until somebody really puts their foot down and says, this is unacceptable, we're kind of going to be in this space where everybody's mixing together and we have a mixture of old school, quote unquote, old school values that Venn diagram overlap with a lot of racist values. And then conversations about Pride Night and things like that, and people exercising what they are saying is religious values, which unfortunately then also promote homophobic, transphobic values too. So yeah, I think one is kind of like really drawing that hard line, but two is like, if you are like a white coach or administrator, things like headhunting young racialized folks into the hockey community, looking for folks who are keen, talented, and bringing them in, and not necessarily as players. I think this is kind of the short-sightedness of some of the NHL programming, is that we're always looking for players. We want to grow the sport in that way. But I'm talking about athletic trainers, equipment managers, video coaches, behind the bench, C-suite. Like, we need to diversify the game, not just the ice. And I think we focus a lot of things on the ice. Things like making sure you have paid internships. No more of these free internships. That cuts across class lines, but it cuts across racial lines quite intensely as well. And just making sure that there are consequences for racism, right? That whether it should be a more harsh suspension than, some other kind of more normative hockey infractions, right? That's how you really put your foot down on some of these things. So yeah, we need to create a culture where it's uncomfortable for people to think that it's okay to say slightly racist things, to not be, as progressive as they want. So it is kind of like an everyday, how do we model the future that we want? And I realize that, it's not always as easy because you want a 1, 2, 3, these are the checklists, but even just like introducing yourself to the racialized families at the rink. And I always tell my students, I'm like, not in a weird way, like, don't be creepy about it, but just like, do we say hello to people to make sure? Do you have any questions? Like, you can ask me if your kids have questions about things, or like, where do you get your skate sharpened? Those little things that people grow up and kind of take for granted. Something that's come up in another research project of mine is that a truly inclusive community is one where it's okay to be new and it's okay to ask questions. And hockey isn't that. I think there's a lot of, standardized sport cultures that are not that. But how do we create how do we create a culture where new people are like, okay, yeah, like, they've set this up, they've expected me to be here, and it's okay for me not to know things, and I don't feel shame or stupid to ask people questions that, everybody else just seems to get.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree. I actually even wanted to dive in a little bit to that, topic, because one of the things that even myself as a coach, that's like addressing parents and talking to new parents in particular, is never. It's not something that we even really think of, and now it's probably a little bit more at the forefront of organizations like where I coach, where it's very much about bringing hockey into areas where hockey never was traditionally played, like Newark, New Jersey, which it's where the Devils are based. But ironically enough, the culture didn't really explode like everybody assumed it would, until we started seeing players like Bryce Salvador, PK Subban, etc., make their way onto the ice, and then those racialized fans started making their way in and seeing themselves in those roles. But a lot of those new questions started coming up, like, how do I put gear onto my kid? Like I think in your book you had mentioned like left skate versus right skate, and a lot of parents don't necessarily even know. And then you have kids that are getting out onto the ice with their skates on the wrong feet.
Right. There was one parent who, he figured out he marked it left, right on the bottom, so he knew how to like help his kid get dressed.
Yes. But those are the kinds of things, because hockey does have quite the barrier to entry, even if we're excluding conversation about money, which is something that you bring up in your book as well. But just that learning curve, it's quite steep in hockey, and like, far be it from me to look to the evangelical church as a guidepost for anything. But as somebody who's formerly very involved in the evangelical church, one thing that they actually do relatively well is create a fantastic onboarding experience. So if you're new to this place, you have easy roads in where you can learn about what you're supposed to do, where you're supposed to go, and all of these kinds of things. And I almost wonder if these various hockey organizations can take a page out of a not so friendly institution's book to see if there are ways that we can make the onboarding experience a little easier for people. And so let's talk a little bit about that as well, and maybe sit there for a couple minutes. You like what we were just mentioning, that access to hockey is not just about money, it's about navigating this culture of sort of unspoken norms and relationships. The question of where do I get my skates sharpened is often left unanswered in a lot of organizations, because you just sort of know there's a pro shop there or wherever, whatever the answer might be, but a lot of people don't necessarily know. How do as you were kind of going through your research for the book, how do South Asian families confront these sort of hidden gatekeepers?
Do you mean like what are some of those? What are those gatekeeping mechanisms?
Okay, let's do that. Yeah, what are some of those gatekeepers, and then what are some of the things that you've noticed might turn into obstacles for South Asian families in particular? And did you come across in any of your conversations strategies for navigating that, and maybe solutions from the part of the on the behalf of the organization to try to break down some of those barriers? Sorry, that was a lot.
Yeah, I mean, no to the last question for sure. Like parents are just like trying to tread and keep their heads above water, and then if they manage to survive, they stay in the game. But yeah, I mean, things like, as you said, like, where do you get your skate sharpened? How often do you get your skate sharpened? What do I get my skates sharpened at? Like, those are all things that are not generally shared with folks unless somebody has been really thoughtful and done kind of like an introductory session. How do you put your gear on? In what order do you put your gear on? These are all things that hockey is just exceptionally difficult compared to like a sport like basketball, right? And so the way that hockey culture reproduces itself is that if those people who have had the privilege of playing the game have that knowledge, they're able to pass it down to the next generation, right? So if your father, your brother, your mother got the opportunity to play hockey, there are some things that they'll just know. They won't have to ask anybody. They'll understand that there's a tryout process. They'll understand perhaps that there is spring hockey, which is like, why am I playing hockey in the winter and the summer? Well, because if you want to be elite, especially in Canada, you play all year round, despite what all the research says about playing multiple sports. You'll understand that there are extra opportunities to get better, like power skating lessons, that you're supposed to kind of be on the ice maybe 7 days a week, and that there are extra fees that will come throughout the year. So we've decided we're going to go to a tournament. We're going to buy these things. So not just that you've paid your registration fee at the start and that's what you budgeted for, but all of a sudden, all these extra costs are coming down the line. So all of these things make it very hard for folks who don't understand that hockey is a little bit weirder than some other sports. Like if you sign your kid up for swimming lessons and you paid up front and that's just, 8 weeks and that's what it is. So yeah, all of this kind of like secret cultural knowledge that gets passed on through generations, at least we're at a stage where now we're seeing racialized families who can pass down that knowledge as well. But then we have the class divide of like which racialized families get to experience this privilege and then pass down that knowledge to the next generation. So as for like how people have navigated it, yeah, it's just learning on the fly. And if you're lucky that you have another, parent to kind of share some of that information with you. But there's a huge time commitment with hockey that, out rivals pretty much every other sport. And it means that maybe you can't go to whatever religious ceremonies you are used to with your family. That hockey is supposed to take over your entire life, and that your family schedule becomes the hockey schedule, and then you're lucky if you can kind of slot other things in. So yeah, that's a tall order to ask people who are either settling in or have a very strong culture outside of sport. So yeah, I think at some point, I think we're going to have to pare down what is expected of minor hockey players in particular. And only then will it start to become more and more accessible. And it would be nice if it were returned kind of to a public school system where a lot of people could try it that way. But also like understanding that ball hockey and roller hockey are versions of hockey that are more accessible and fun as well. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't think that there has been a lot of allyship, I guess is what you're kind of pointing to, through the organizations to support South Asian families who are kind of learning on the fly. But again, these are things that folks can do. If you understand some of these nuances and there are new families coming in to your association and team, just make sure that they have some of these. And again, that asking questions is okay and that they're not trying to figure this out themselves, because Googling what skate sharpening you're supposed to have, I don't think a lot of people have time for that as parents too.
No, absolutely. Something that you pointed out in your book that I found really fascinating was the conversation surrounding racialized communities creating their own sort of leagues and clinics, and that this is sometimes framed as a kind of self-segregation. And when I read that, I confess I myself thought, wow, that sounds like a really cool environment. Like I would feel way more at home playing in a beer league that was made up of predominantly East Asian players, or even Asian in general players. And yet that doesn't seem to have garnered a whole lot of interest when brought up in your research. How do you unpack maybe some of those responses and the way that people might bristle at that idea? What are some thoughts as you sort of reflect on those conversations?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the classic thing of like, well, aren't you just excluding us now? Kind of like women's only hours at the gym. Like, isn't that sexist against men? Right? Like these kinds of conversations. The reality is that people are creating their own spaces because the mainstream has continued to exclude them in some way, and not like the way that it used to be when it was like segregation was legalized and we could say that this was whites only or men's only, but through culture, right? Through just creating a violent or unsafe space, or just making people miserable. So people now, through social media, through having, increased financial mobility themselves, are creating organizations, opportunities for themselves to excel at whatever sport or activity they haven't had the chance to kind of integrate into. Is it ideal? In some ways, no, because then you're creating silos of people, and that's obviously not kind of the future we want. But if that's how people at this point feel like they can participate and have a good time, then this is the reality. It would be nice if everybody fed back into the same system. But I could also see in the future, particularly with scouts, being like, oh, you trained in that league or whatever. Yeah, that's not the kind of people that we're looking for, right? It could be a way that you end up dismissing people on the face of it as well. But this is kind of the space that we're at. We've tried the integration thing in a, kind of half-hearted way.
Yeah.
And now we're ending up with, kind of pockets of folks doing their things elsewhere. So yeah, I think this is a really interesting future to follow and see where things kind of end up. But I think, Akeem Alou is a perfect example of someone who's really trying to create an alternative pathway for racialized kids to try hockey and stay out of the mainstream system. Like if he's trying to create a league, a structure where people can kind of move through and advance. That's interesting. I don't know where this is all going to go. But it's something to keep an eye on. And it is a way to introduce people to the game and get them to fall in love with it. But at what point and how do we get everybody on the same page? That is the question that we have not been able to answer yet.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about the title of your book, Changing on the Fly. This is sort of an allusion to the adaptability that's required of hockey players, and that institutions often demand adaptability from their players. I mean, and even the phrase "changing on the fly," right? Like that's something that I coach a lot of like really young learn to play kind of environments, and until after maybe the later stages of the environments that I usually coach in, we don't do any changing on the fly. It's just too chaotic. Kids have no idea what's going on. So fortunately, in those games, we at different intervals, every couple of minutes, a whistle is blown and we switch things up. And so there's a little bit of like an advanced kind of IQ, quote unquote, from children that's necessary in order to get used to the idea of changing on the fly. But I love the thought behind that and what it kind of signifies, because hockey has been around for over a century at this point, and the institution of the NHL has been around for over a century, and there's no way to just blow the whistle, say, okay, everybody pause, and now let's change things. We have to sort of change on the fly. What I find so fascinating and frustrating is that I think this is what I really wanted to say. Sorry, as I was kind of introing the question. The demand of adaptability from its players, yet institutions like the NHL refuse to adapt. What do you think it means for anyone, institutions, participants, players, fans, etc., to do anti-racism work on the fly? And perhaps how can people start where they currently are, and move into new territory, new spaces, change, quote unquote, on the fly, as it were?
I mean, I think the first part is to educate yourself. There are so many resources out there. This is the thing you should be Googling, right? If you don't Google what depth you're supposed to be doing your skates at, do Google books about racism and how you yourself can be part of the solution. Robin DiAngelo is an author who wrote White Fragility, and she's got a good line. She was like, people ask her all the time, how can I help solve racism? And she was like, do you realize how at the age of an adult, how problematic that question is, that you have, however number of years old, you don't understand, you don't know what to do about it. And that is a privilege, right? That you've never had to think about, how do I be part of the solution and not part of the problem, right? So education, I think, self-education, is kind of the starting point. And then how do you then enact it into practice? I think you just kind of start with your kids, start with your team, right? Having those conversations constantly about what is acceptable, what is unacceptable, and how racism shifts. Like, this is a constant education process. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, once I read a couple of modules, I get it. No. We are constantly, as racialized people, learning what racism looks like, how it's manipulating itself, how it's going to recreate itself anew so that it stays alive. So that you're always kind of learning new things as well, right? So that you take that labor off of racialized people's shoulders. One of the things that I talk to my students about is, if you deal with your racist uncle and I deal with my racist uncle, and everybody kind of deals with, quote unquote, the racist uncle, whoever that family member or members may be, that means that if you have the conversation about, oh, we don't use that word anymore, that when I encounter that person, hopefully I don't then have to have that conversation with the person, right? So we're alleviating some of that labor. And I realize that people don't feel like they're experts in it. Nobody's really, you just have to, again, you're like learning on the fly how to do these things. And you have the conversation one night and it doesn't go well. Then you go back and you know what to Google now, how to have this conversation. What do I need to learn about, whether it's language or colonialism or whatever, right? And then you have that conversation again, and it's constantly trying to figure out where those weaknesses are. So I think as athletes and hockey players, this is the process we go through athletically all the time. You have practice to figure out what your weaknesses are. You go to the gym to figure out what your weaknesses are, and then we implement them in a game. And we do this cycle, right? So it's not that we learn everything and then everything's always a game. We always do this cycle. And so you have to engage in these conversations to figure out where you're not doing so well and where you can do better. But I think people are also afraid of like alienating certain people for having these conversations. And I think that's a tough reflection that you have to have about yourself and with yourself, is like, are those people that you want to surround yourself with or in your life if you don't share the same kind of value system, right? And again, this is like, how do we make it uncomfortable for people to say these things, to enact these things around us, if this is the environment that we want to create? So, you know, that's what kind of anti-racism means on the fly. And it's like, how do I prevent racism? How do I undo some of these systems? And how do I kind of change the structure of hockey, right, as best as we can? And I realize that that's a big thing for any of us to tackle as individuals. But, you know, it's kind of like an everyday. How do we chip away at it? Because racism didn't become this structure overnight per se, you know, in some ways it did. But for us to dismantle it, it looks like we're going to have to chip away at the system and find the people who believe the same thing that you do, right? It's about creating coalitions and not being the one person in your league that does this work. How do we lean on each other and collectively do this work? Because if you're in it for the long haul. And it's soul-crushing work sometimes, but it can be extremely life-affirming if you find the right people and you kind of uplift each other too. So, you know, finding your team in that way is super important to keep you going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I love that. It's that idea of building coalitions, like you said, and collective action is so crucial in this time that we're in right now. Before we kind of wrap up a bit, I am curious about some of the work that you're currently working on, post the publication of this book. You had mentioned offline that you're doing a media analysis of Suzy Yin, Vicky Sonjaro, and Julie Chu. I'm curious about that. Do you want to talk a little bit about your work in that area?
Sure. I'm presenting it actually next week at the Hockey Conference. If you haven't heard of it, it's a biannual conference. It'll be in Winnipeg, Manitoba next week. And it's just a bunch of hockey nerds getting together, talking about everything that we love and how we can make this game better.
And a quick plug for that as well. One of our contributing producers, Chad Soon, is going to be giving a talk there as well.
That's right. Chad and I are in the same session, the last session closing down the whole conference.
Ooh, wow.
So yeah, a little bit of pressure. And hopefully people come. But yeah, I've been doing a bit of a media analysis on Suzy Yin, Julie Chu, and Vicky Sonjaro, and kind of contextualizing it with like Asian women's representation in hockey, which isn't really something we've looked at. And we haven't really looked at Asian women in like kind of physical competitive sports, team sports in that many respects either. It's been a lot of like figure skating, golf, individual sports. And so I had expected to find the consistent pattern of the model minority, which is like Asians are academically inclined and athletically kind of inept, and that, you know, they're forever foreign. So Asians are unassimilable, and that we're like physically weak, right? These are kind of the main stereotypes. I didn't find any of that. And I was super surprised, and I was trying to make sense of it. And then I found an article about Suni Lee, the US gymnast, and kind of how she was framed in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics by the media. And I found very similar patterns with that, arguing that there is a new model minority in that we are not seen as kind of like the dangerous forever foreign body. Now we are, whether American or Canadian, in a way that serves the nation, and helps to erase the racial racism of whether it's the imperial or colonial or military past of Canada and the US on Asian countries. So whether we're kind of overlooking military invasions or Japanese internment, things like that, and we use the success of these Asian hockey players to say, it wasn't that bad, right? Like Vicky Sanahara's family experienced Japanese internment, but look at what a great hockey player she has become, and resilient because of the struggles that her family has had to experience. And that they become kind of co-opted for the benefit of the nation, and also written about as their families are extremely supportive and loving, opposite to the way we understand Asian families as overbearing. The dragon mom, kind of like policing and oppressing their children. So it's a really interesting kind of juxtaposition to see how some Asians are written about and others are not. You know, like a Michelle Kwan was kind of seen as very not American, even though she was winning medals for America. And then other Asian athletes can be written about as like, oh, no, you're a quintessential American or Canadian success story. And I haven't quite figured out why certain people get to have that privilege. I would argue that in hockey, because you're one of like 23 players on a roster, your Asianness gets diluted by the otherwise whiteness of the team. And so it's not as threatening, perhaps. But yeah, I think it's something that we need to kind of do more research into, because we haven't really explored Asian women athletes as physically strong and, you know, kind of assertive, aggressive competitors in their own right. And so that's kind of a new area for us to be thinking through.
That sounds very fascinating. So if you're listening to this and it is before the hockey conference takes place and you happen to be in the Winnipeg area, definitely try to go register and check it out. It sounds like a good time. It's too bad I'm in the New York City area, and a trip to Winnipeg is probably out of the cards for me this year.
It's not that far.
Courtney, thank you so much for spending this time here with us. This was quite the conversation, and I could even speak even more at length with you, because I've got so many more questions and things rolling around in my brain that I'd love to pick your brain about. But we'll call it here. I guess we'll sound the horn and say farewell. But is there anything that you want to plug? Where can people find you online if they want to follow you, if they want to get a hold of your work? Obviously, I'll be putting all of this stuff in the show notes, but if you want to mention it here for anyone who's driving and can't go clicking around in their show notes at the moment.
Good question. I mean, I guess I'm on Blue Sky these days, under just first name, last name, Courtney Szto. Not on there nearly as much as I was on Twitter, but I guess we need to recreate the community all over again. And I would check out hockeyandsociety.com, where we have a lot of our kind of, you know, academics writing about hockey in as accessible ways as possible to try to get some of these ideas to the non-academic community. Those would be kind of the best places to find me. Awesome.
Well, thanks again so much, Courtney. This has been a blast, and don't be a stranger. Let's keep in touch, and we'll see if there's anything else that we can converse about. So I'm sure our listeners would be more interested in more of what you're working on as well. So
thank you. Happy to chat anytime. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Okay, that does it for today's episode of the Asians in Hockey podcast. Our next episode, which includes my conversation with Mari Horita, the Senior Vice President of Social Impact and Civic Affairs with the Seattle Kraken, will be out soon. Like I said at the end of last week's episode, my conversation with Mari was fantastic, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Thank you so much for listening. Asians in Hockey is a part of the Potluck Podcast Collective and is hosted and produced by Nate Nickow. Contributing producers are Chad Soon and Chris Wu. Original music by Scott Okamoto. If you like what you heard, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share this podcast with your friends. To keep up with us on socials, follow us on Instagram and Threads at Asians in Hockey and on Blue Sky at asiansinhockey.com. You can also find us on Facebook at facebook.com/asiansinhockey. And please feel free to shoot me an email at asiansinhockey@gmail.com. See you next time on the Asians in Hockey podcast.